Today we are bombarded with words and phrases such as reimagining policing, equity, social justice, systemic racism, white privilege, and safe spaces. Most of these, of course, have no clear definition, but there are other, once common words and phrases that have fallen out of use. Some examples are duty, self-responsibility, civility, self-control, and the rule of law. My name is Mark Garrett, and welcome to this first brief podcast of Your Leo Nation. After 30 years of public service, I retired as a chief with the California Highway Patrol. My journey to being promoted to top management of one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the nation was not a path I planned to take or even considered possible during my formative years or early adulthood. But some solid advice from those close to me and a little good fortune placed me on that road to service. The first 10 years of my life were spent growing up in Southeast Los Angeles, an area known as Watts. I was 2 years old when the Watts riots erupted in 1965. Ironically, the match that lit off days of rioting that changed Los Angeles forever was a traffic stop initiated 3 blocks from my childhood house. On that day, a California Highway Patrol officer made a traffic stop on a black man for suspicion of drunk driving. This fateful traffic stop occurred only 3 blocks from the house I lived in with my parents and siblings, a home my father built himself for his family after he returned home from World War II. That was the first of many culturally significant events that took place during the first 10 years of my life. During that time, I witnessed the birth of the Crips and the Bloods, the 2 most notorious Los Angeles street gangs whose roots were just a few miles from the home I grew up in. And even though I was very young, I remember the tremendous shock and sense of loss that my parents, teachers, and older siblings felt in response to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. These events, as much as any experience in my life, influenced my personal philosophy, my lifelong commitment to the rule of law, self-responsibility, and a belief in a civil society. To be more specific, it wasn't these traumatic events themselves, the riots and the King assassination, but my parents' response to the events that had the most impact on me. They never gave up on our American ideals. The issue to them was the lack of fair implementation of our American ideals, not the foundational philosophy itself. My parents grew up poor and black in the Jim Crow South during the Great Depression. My mother was the product of a mixed-race relationship, which was particularly difficult in that time and place. They endured circumstances and challenges I'm grateful I never had to face. Throughout their lives, however, they practiced timeless virtues. They abided by the law and worked to change the laws they didn't agree with through the voting process. They also took responsibility for their own actions. They contributed to their community. They taught me to be grateful to God for His many blessings. This podcast, Your Leo Nation, Leo standing for law enforcement officer, is grounded in the belief that law enforcement begins with each of us. If each of us obeys the laws and sets an example for our own family, the way my parents did, it allows our community, society, and nation to survive and flourish. In other words, self-policing, self-control, and individual responsibility are at the core of any civil society. None of us are perfect in relation to these goals, including me, but they must be priorities in our individual lives before we look outward to blame someone or something else. In recent decades, we have witnessed an increasingly aggressive campaign to diminish the concept of the rule of law. Instead, we see media personalities, so-called civil rights groups, and elected officials demonize the law enforcement profession as unethical and racist. More recently, not only activists but elected officials have called for the defunding and dismantling of police altogether. To quote one such politician, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar said, "So we cannot stop at the criminal justice system. We must begin the work of dismantling the whole system of repression wherever we find it." These types of statements are not only dangerous for society, but at best, they are rooted in willful ignorance and pure, hateful dishonesty at worst. The video of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes is of course disgusting. Derek Chauvin was sentenced to 22.5 years in prison, and all of us who respect and honor the vast majority of good police officers believe he got exactly what he deserved. Ilhan Omar and others who perpetrate the notion that Chauvin is an example of law enforcement culture should be ashamed of themselves, but they are not. They have no shame. They use the word systemic as if a pattern of behavior exists from one police department to the next. The fact is, police officers make over 10 million arrests every year in this country. In 2018, about 990 of those suspects were killed by police. That is 0.0001% of those arrested. Not stopped, but actually arrested. No one with any sense of fairness, objectivity, honesty, or perspective would claim those numbers represent anything other than an example of how rarely officers actually use deadly force. Not to mention, almost every one of those suspects was engaged in behavior that put the officer or officers in a position of self-defense or self-preservation. Law enforcement is certainly not perfect, but law enforcement is not the problem. Criminals are the real problem. Criminality is why every modern society must have law enforcement. The lawmakers and so-called social justice organizations who make excuses for criminal behavior are the problem. The heads of some police agencies who literally kneel to political pressure rather than speak the truth are the problem. When bad officers commit infractions of their agency's rules, they should be disciplined appropriately so that the punishment matches the infraction. If they break the law, they should be subject to the same penalties as civilians. This process should be as transparent as possible so that the public knows that law enforcement officers should have the same rights, but also must be faced with the same penalties as anyone else. Let me be clear about this. No law enforcement agency or division of the government is ever improved by covering up bias, malfeasance, and dereliction of duty or criminality. That only causes the public to lose faith in our agencies. It is time to reaffirm the honor of the law enforcement profession, to champion its indispensable role in the preservation of a civil society, and to strengthen the resolve of law enforcement leadership to act based on principle, integrity, and with courage. Please join us on the Your Leo Nation podcast as we speak with true leaders from the law enforcement profession, elected officials, community members, and rank-and-file cops who are doing the job that their detractors would and could never do. Tell everyone you know who supports our men and women of the law enforcement profession to become part of the Your Leo Nation family. I'm the Chief, Mark Garrett.